Take a look at a world map. The southern part of Europe and the northern part of Africa practically touch each other. If you look closely, there's only a thin strip of water between them, the Strait of Gibraltar. At its narrowest point, between Cape Marroquí in Spain and Cape Ceres in Morocco, the distance is only 14 kilometers. That's a trivial distance compared to what modern engineering is capable of today. What makes this fact especially strange is that over 50 bridges significantly longer than this strait have already been built around the world. For example, the longest bridge in the world, the Danyang Kunshan Grand Bridge in China, stretches for 164 kilometers. That's more than 11 times the distance between Europe and Africa across the Strait of Gibraltar. Furthermore, there are at least 10 bridges that run entirely over water and exceed those same 14 kilometers. So, the technology exists, the experience exists, and it seems there's money in the world too. So why hasn't anyone built a bridge between Europe and Africa yet? Where is it? Why are two continents, separated by the distance of a morning jog, still not connected? That's the billion-dollar question. And, as always, the answer turns out to be much more complicated than simply nobody needs it. Before exploring why a bridge hasn't been built between Europe and Africa, it's logical to ask, why build it in the first place? What's so special about this connection that it's been discussed for decades? Firstly, its importance can't be overstated. This isn't just a bridge across a strait. It's a direct land crossing between two continents. Essentially, a new international corridor. If it existed, roughly 1.5 billion Africans would have direct access to Europe, and approximately 740 million Europeans would have the same direct access to Africa. That's potentially millions of people crossing the bridge every day. Just imagine the impact on movement, trade, and tourism. This is especially evident in the case of Morocco. In 2022, the country became the second most visited tourist destination in Africa, generating about $9 billion in tourism revenue. According to 2023 estimates, about 70% of foreign tourists in Morocco are Europeans. And if there were a direct land connection, we could confidently expect the flow of tourists to increase dramatically. That means more money, more jobs, and more development. On the other side of the strait is Spain, already one of the world's leading tourist countries. According to the World Tourism Organization, it ranked second in the world in terms of tourist arrivals in 2018, with over 82 million people. But here's the paradox. Its neighbor across the way, Morocco, accounted for only about 1% of that flow. This raises a legitimate question. Is it not a lack of interest, but a lack of convenient access? A bridge could fix this, significantly increasing the number of Moroccans and other Africans visiting Europe. But tourism is only one aspect. A much more serious argument is trade. Today, Africa is the European Union's fourth most important trading partner. In 2019 alone, trade between the continents amounted to about 270 billion euros. Most of this is moved either by sea or by air. Both methods are expensive, and both are slower or more costly than land transport. If goods could be transported by high-speed rail across a bridge, it would simplify logistics and reduce delivery costs. Less reliance on sea routes, lower air freight costs. All this makes the bridge not just a pretty idea, but a real economic tool. In theory, everything looks like a win-win: tourism development, trade acceleration, improved connections. But in practice, theory and reality aren't always the closest of friends. Now that it's clear how important and beneficial a bridge between Europe and Africa could be, it's logical to ask the next question: what's stopping its construction? The answer: everything. Absolutely everything you can imagine. For starters, there's the Strait of Gibraltar itself. It's not just a piece of water between two continents. It's one of the busiest sea routes on the planet. All maritime traffic between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea passes through it. That is, if you want ships from Suez to reach London, Hamburg, or New York, they pass through Gibraltar. About 100,000 ships pass through here every year. For comparison, about 14,000 pass through the Panama Canal. In other words, Gibraltar isn't just a busy route. It's a global transportation artery, and any attempt to block or restrict it is like cutting off one of the central veins of the world economy. Now imagine construction beginning. Let's say the bridge is 14 kilometers long. By analogy with other major marine bridges, construction will take years. Example, the bridge between Rio de Janeiro and Niterói, about 13 kilometers long, took 5 years to build. Now imagine that during all this time, trucks, barges, platforms, and construction cranes are sailing through Gibraltar, blocking the path of ships. 100,000 ships a year is roughly one every 5 minutes. That means even a slight delay turns into a logistical nightmare. But let's assume the bridge is built. Now it must be high enough for giant cargo ships to pass underneath. Example, the Jacques Sade, one of the largest container ships in the world, has a total height of about 78 meters above the waterline. To pass under the bridge, it needs at least 80 meters of clearance. That's already higher than, for example, the famous Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And that's just the above-water part. These bridges also have underwater supports. And that's where a completely different story begins, because Gibraltar isn't just busy. It's also a surprisingly deep strait. At first glance, it might seem that depth is just a technical parameter. You take it, drill it, build it. But the Strait of Gibraltar isn't one of those places where you can just take it and drill it. In the narrowest part, its average depth is about 370 meters. And in some areas, the depth reaches 900 meters. For comparison, the depth under the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco is just over 90 meters. That is, Gibraltar is at least 4 times deeper. Now let's look at existing bridges. The deepest of these is the Padma Bridge in Bangladesh. Its supports go to a depth of 127 meters. To build a bridge across Gibraltar, it would be necessary to delve into the seabed by at least 700–900 meters, 6 to 7 times deeper than any existing project. And that's just to get to a solid foundation. And if you thought that already sounded like a death sentence, wait. Because depth isn't the only problem. Below the seabed lies something engineers fear even more than water: a tectonic fault. The Strait of Gibraltar lies directly on the border between the African and Eurasian plates, as well as the Iberian microplate. These plates slowly but surely rub against each other, accumulating stress. At some point, a click and an earthquake occurs. An example from history is the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The magnitude was about 9 points. The epicenter was west of Gibraltar. In Lisbon alone, 12,000 buildings were destroyed. And then came the tsunami. 6-meter waves crashed into Portugal, Spain, and Morocco. In total, about 70,000 people died. And this isn't an isolated case. In 2004, northern Morocco was shaken by 6.3 points. More than 600 people died, and over 2,500 buildings collapsed. The area is unstable. Building something substantial here is like putting a glass tower on a moving plate. Of course, one might object that bridges are built in Japan, and nothing happens. For example, the Akashi Kaikyo Bridge stands directly above a seismically active area. But they used a special design: flexible steel supports capable of moving with the earth, and dampers, heavy pendulums that compensate for vibrations. Theoretically, such technologies can be applied in Gibraltar. But Gibraltar has another feature. unstable clay channels on the bottom. These are soft, loose deposits that are easily displaced under pressure or seismic activity. That is, even if you reach the bottom, there's no guarantee that it will hold you. And so you stand. Above you is an international shipping hell. Below you is a tectonic catastrophe. And between them is water, almost a kilometer deep. A great place for a mega project, right? If there were still doubts that a bridge across Gibraltar wasn't the easiest engineering task, it's now time to add another problem to the list: cost. Even if you turn a blind eye to the depth, earthquakes, and clay, the main question remains: who will pay for it all? For example, the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge. This is a huge bridge tunnel system, 55 kilometers long. Its construction cost about $18 billion, which is roughly equivalent to 16.5 billion euros. But the main thing isn't just the length, but how complex the project was. Underwater tunnels, artificial islands, huge spans. Now imagine, Gibraltar isn't just deep, it's also seismically active, with an unstable bottom and frantic shipping. It's logical to assume that the construction cost here will be no less, and most likely even higher. Now ask yourself, who will pay? The project affects several countries at once: Spain, Morocco, and indirectly Great Britain, since part of the water area is controlled by British Gibraltar. That is, this isn't just an international project, but a potential geopolitical mine. And we're not talking about some new road. These are tens of billions of euros that need to be invested in an area where something is shaking, staggering, or protesting every week. An alternative? Yes, and it already works. Ferries run across the strait daily, on routes between Tarifa and Tangier, as well as between Tangier and Algeciras. Plus, there's aviation. About 1,000 flights a day connect Europe and North Africa. In short, if you want to cross the strait, there are no problems. You don't need a bridge, a tunnel, or engineering magic. Just take a ferry or a plane, and in half an hour, you're on another continent. So, from a practical point of view, a bridge isn't a necessity, but a luxury. Yes, it would be convenient. Yes, it would look impressive. But under the current conditions, it isn't worth the effort and money it would take to implement it, especially considering that there are much cheaper and proven ways to get from Spain to Morocco and back. And even if someone crazy enough is found, ready to invest in this giant bridge, another problem will arise: politics. Because geography is geography, but international relations haven't been canceled. And the relations between the countries affected by this project are, to put it mildly, not the warmest. Let's start with Spain and Morocco. On the one hand, they are neighbors, only 14 kilometers of water apart. On the other hand, there are decades of territorial disputes and mutual grievances. Take Ceuta and Melilla, for example, two cities located in northern Africa, but which are autonomous territories of Spain. Ceuta was captured by the Portuguese in the early 15th century, and then in the mid-17th century went to Spain, and Melilla was conquered by the Spaniards at the end of the 15th century. And to this day, these cities are under Spanish control. From Morocco's point of view, this is an occupation. These lands must be returned. After gaining independence in 1956, Moroccans began actively demanding the return of these territories. A year later, protests began in another Spanish enclave, Ifni. It all resulted in an open-armed conflict, the Ifni War, which lasted 8 months. As a result, Spain lost control over the southern part of Ifni, but never gave up Ceuta and Melilla. And to this day, in the 21st century, Morocco demands their return, and Spain isn't even going to discuss this topic. They say that these cities are part of the Spanish state, and that's it. How can you imagine working together on a billion-dollar project when one side considers the other an illegal occupier? It's as if two neighbors were building a house, but one of them kept saying that half of the plot was his. And as if that weren't enough, another player intervenes in the equation: Great Britain. Because on the Spanish side of the strait is Gibraltar, officially a British overseas territory. It was captured in 1704 during the War of the Spanish Succession, and in 1713 Spain officially ceded Gibraltar to Britain. 300 years have passed since then, but the Spaniards have not reconciled. Gibraltar is still considered a disputed territory. And yes, it isn't directly on the line of the proposed bridge, but it controls part of the strait. This means that without the participation of Great Britain, such a project won't go ahead either. And now, we already have 3 participants: Spain, Morocco, and Britain. And none of them are on particularly warm terms with the other 2. And after that, do you still want them to agree on a joint construction project of the century? Only in a parallel reality. As if tectonics, depth, price, and politics haven't already made this project impossible enough. Something completely unexpected comes into play: wildlife. In particular, orcas. Yes, those black and white marine predators that are usually shown in nature documentaries have become a real threat to anyone who dares to venture into the waters of the Strait of Gibraltar. In May 2023, a group of experienced sailors was sailing through the strait when they suddenly felt a powerful impact on the hull. It turned out that a pod of orcas had broken the rudder of their yacht. The ship began to take on water and sank. The people were rescued, but the shock remained. And no, this isn't an accident. Since 2020, about 700 similar incidents have been recorded in the Gibraltar area. Orcas rammed boats, broke equipment, and sank ships. The reasons for this aggression aren't yet known for certain. Some scientists believe that the reason is a lack of food. Orcas supposedly perceive boats as competitors. Others suggest that these animals do it simply for pleasure. In any case, if a pod of 1.5-ton mammals with the intelligence of a 5-year-old decides that you're in their way, all that's left for you to do is stay away. Now imagine a large-scale construction project being launched in this region. Barges, construction platforms, transport ships, and underwater workers appear. All this equipment and personnel become potential targets for these marine thugs. Considering that an orca can reach 9 meters in length, develop a speed of up to 55 km per hour, and has a bite force of 85 kilonewtons, which is almost 120 times stronger than a human bite, the risk becomes quite real. And the most alarming thing is that orcas don't behave like wild animals, but like vindictive personalities. They clearly react to irritants, remember ships, and, apparently, transmit information within their group. This isn't just instinct, it's a conscious tactic. Add to this the fact that any underwater work, welding, installation, cables, requires the participation of people underwater. Commercial divers, underwater engineers, all of them will be in the zone of potential attack. And if orcas are able to sink a yacht, then it's not difficult to imagine what they can do to a person. And now, as a cherry on top, a little ancient Greek madness. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, Hercules allegedly squeezed the shores of Gibraltar to prevent monsters from the Atlantic from entering the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, this is most likely a myth, but just in case he wasn't lying, maybe it's really not worth waking up the evil, especially if it's the size of a submarine. Despite all of the above, talk of a bridge or at least some connection between Europe and Africa doesn't subside. And from time to time, ideas appear that sound like something out of science fiction. One such project was proposed by American architect Eugene Suey in 2004. His concept isn't just a bridge. It's a hybrid of a bridge, an underwater tunnel, and a floating island. According to the plan, the crossing between Tarifa in Spain and Point Ceres in Morocco would begin with a kilometer-long land section, which would then gradually go underwater, turning into a concrete tunnel about 3 kilometers long. The maximum depth of this tunnel is 200 meters. This is much less than the 900-meter depth in the very center of the strait, but enough not to interfere with shipping. According to the idea, cars, buses, and even trains could move along this tunnel, a total of 24 lanes of traffic. All this is underwater in a sealed concrete pipe. The project then became even more ambitious. Somewhere in the middle of the strait, it was planned to place a giant 3-kilometer floating island. Yes, exactly an island. It was supposed to house a tourist resort, a theater, and even 150 wind turbines. And underwater, another 80 turbines, but water turbines. According to the architect, this design could generate enough energy to provide electricity not only to the southern Spanish city of Cadiz, but to all of Morocco. The price of the entire project is about $10 billion. Tsui claimed that thanks to electricity generation, the bridge could pay for itself. But if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. To begin with, wind and hydro turbines are, of course, useful. But to provide electricity to a country with a population of almost 40 million people, you need not 230 turbines, but tens of thousands. According to estimates, about 48,000 wind generators are required to fully supply energy to Great Britain, where slightly more than 70 million people live. The second question is technical. How exactly should this island float? How should it withstand storms, ocean currents, pressure drops? How should the concrete tunnel hold up underwater at a depth of 200 meters and not fall deeper? What will happen to this structure during an earthquake? The author of the concept, to put it mildly, had no answers to these questions. The project remained at the concept level and most likely will remain there forever. It sounds beautiful. It looks futuristic, but in practice it is an architectural fantasy with dozens of unsolvable problems. Fantasy is fantasy, but the idea of an underwater connection between Europe and Africa appeared long before Eugene Sui. Back in the 1930s, Spain proposed building a tunnel under the Strait of Gibraltar. The plan was simple: to build an underground corridor along which cars and trains could move. But it quickly became clear that it was only simple on paper. Studies have shown that the seabed in the strait area consists of extremely hard rock. It was impossible to drill it using conventional methods, especially by the standards of the 30s. One of the engineers suggested bypassing the problem by attaching a pre-built concrete tunnel to the seabed with super strong cables. The concept was so complex and unrealistic for the time that it was quickly put aside. However, the idea itself didn't die. In 1994, the famous Channel Tunnel between Great Britain and France opened. This was a precedent. 50 kilometers under the sea, $30 billion and decades of work. But most importantly, it proved that underwater tunnels are possible. So why not do the same between Spain and Morocco? The problem is, again, in geology. The Channel Tunnel passes through chalk rocks, which are relatively soft and easy to drill. The maximum depth is about 75 meters below the seabed. The total depth is about 115 meters from the water surface. For comparison, if you build a tunnel in the narrowest part of the Strait of Gibraltar, you will have to descend to a depth of about 900 meters. This is almost 8 times deeper, and instead of chalk, there is super hard rock. The difference is fundamental. Nevertheless, the idea received a second life in 1979. Then, Spain and Morocco agreed to conduct a joint study to understand whether it was still possible to build an underwater connection. The result was the Europe-Africa fixed link across the Strait of Gibraltar project. According to the plan, an underground railway was to connect Madrid and Casablanca, passing under the strait. Interestingly, the engineers decided not to follow the narrowest section, but to shift the route to the west between Tarifa and Tangier. Yes, the distance is longer, about 28 kilometers underwater, but the maximum depth here is about 450 meters. This is still almost 6 times deeper than in the Channel Tunnel, but not 1,000. Less crazy, if you can say so. However, even with this approach, there are enough problems. The seabed remains difficult to drill, and the risk of earthquakes doesn't go away. For this reason, for decades the project remained in a state of perpetual discussion and didn't move beyond papers. But in 2023, a new factor appeared that could finally get things moving: football. Spain, Portugal, and Morocco were chosen to host the 2030 FIFA World Cup. This will be the first tournament that will be held on 2 continents at once. This means that millions of fans will move between Europe and Africa, and preferably quickly. In the same year, Spain allocated about 2.5 million euros for a new feasibility study for the tunnel. According to calculations, the underwater railway will be able to transport up to 12,800 passengers per year. A train from Madrid to Casablanca will take only 5 hours, which is 7 hours faster than traveling by car with a ferry crossing. Maybe, this time, the idea will live to be realized. But even if it does, it won't be soon. Because, as the almost century-old history of these plans shows, there is a gap between talk and construction. Sometimes, literally. What do you think? Is it really possible to bring such a grandiose project to life someday? Write in the comments. See you soon!